Greetings, everybody, and welcome. You join us today on the evening of the 20th of August 2024, where we are going to be exploring the possibility of Kamala Harris actually being a communist. Of course, this is a joke. This is a joke that has come from a certain President Trump, who has decided that Kamala mumbling incoherently about ending price gouging was the equivalent to the refoundation of the Comintern. This is, of course, all untrue, and we will be exploring why tonight. But let's start with a rather basic question. Why is it that 100 and almost 180 odd years, 176 years later, the spectre of communism still haunts the ruling class of the United States? Why is it that what Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto still remains true, which is that there is not an opposition party that has not had the insult of communism thrown at it, meaning that the communism is considered by most of the bourgeois, to be the ultimate epithet to throw at every liberal-ish, left-ish, very-ish parties in election season. And it's because, of course, to the bourgeois, there's nothing worse than a communist. And therefore, if you throw that epithet at the Democrats, they have to work even harder to prove themselves to be the loyal servants of monopoly capital we know that they are. So what was it that Kamala Harris actually proposed? Well, it turns out not to have been very much. She made some statements saying that she was going to end price gouging. But what these turned into after just a few short days was going from a plan that was said, okay, again, this is reported in the Washington Post, so one of the CIA's in-house journals, and very, very close to the leadership of the Democratic Party. So within a few days, according to reporting by Jeff Stein, this story from Stein came out on the 15th. Kamala Harris to propose ban on price gouging for food and groceries. And this was to take the form of a policy statement made last Friday, which was vague. Now, in 5 days, of course, there was a screaming objection. Not from Trump. Well, Trump was branding, it's communism, Soviet price controls, everybody. Everybody's going to be walking around like fucking Brezhnev. This sort of evaporated in a few days, though. They're now saying, again, according to a report by Jeff Stein in today's Washington Post, that Kamala's ban on price gouging was misconstrued. Now, what it's actually turned into is a non-plan for states to use existing powers of consumer protection to fine companies and retailers who are seen to be overcharging. So they're not going to stop the overcharging at all under this supposed plan. What it amounts to is essentially saying that states should fine companies more who overcharge. So does nothing to answer the problem facing the American worker, which is that they cannot afford the necessities of life and can't afford to live decently. None of that is going to be addressed by Kamala's non-plan, of course. And it even starts to make Richard Nixon's 1971 price freezing order look comparatively radical. Now, for those who aren't aware, Nixon in 1971 issued something called an Executive Order 11615, which was in response to increasing inflation and an economic crisis that had been gathering pace in the United States since at least the middle 60s, so at least 1965, that was exacerbated by the effects of the Vietnam War and the losing of the Vietnam War. So Nixon in the early 70s, he's faced with the spiraling cost of living crisis and inflation crisis. Increased waves of militancy are coming from what was still at the time quite a powerful union movement in the United States in certain areas. There was quite a lot of industrial struggle in the early 1970s. So Nixon, in response to that, took a couple of measures. Passed something called the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970, and in this executive order that followed it in 1971, he took the following action, which I'm going to read to you from the executive order. You can find this on the quite easily online. I'll just post the link to where I got it from inside the chat, so you can all have a look at what I'm reading from. So, Section 1 in this order by Nixon from 1971 reads as follows: prices, rents, wages, and salaries shall be stabilized for a period of 90 days, from the date hereof at levels not greater than the highest of those pertaining to a substantial volume of actual transactions by each individual business, firm, or other entity of any kind during the 30-day period ending August 14th, 1971, for like or similar commodities or services. So, to translate that into out of bureaucrat into human, Nixon, in the wanting to appear even-handed, in response to rising American workers' militancy, took a decision in 1971 to actually slap a federal ban on wage increases for 90 days. But in order that he could appear as if he was being even-handed, he also had to slap a ban on price increases or rent increases as well. So this was only for a 90-day period, but it was much more comprehensive than anything Harris has said, and of course Trump has said no such thing. If you asked Trump, well, I don't think he'd have an answer about what to do about price increases. He'd probably say, what we'll do is we'll have the best economy. Everybody will be employed. Everybody's wages will be going up and up, just like our falafel said. And so, therefore, there will be no need for these Soviet price controls. But Nixon actually did establish a cost of living council and enforced the ban on price and wage rises for 90 days. None of that is going to happen with Harris, never mind Trump. And it's important to emphasize as to why. As I already stated, but even in the early 1970s, following the political defeat of the most militant sections of the US workers' movement in the late 40s, with the purging of the communists from the labor movement, the American Union movement went into a stagnation and then decline over the 50s and the 60s. But it retained some very strong areas, such as the car industry, the steel industry, and also coal mining as well. In certain areas was very well unionized, as was the docks. A lot of the dock workers were well unionized. So whereas it wasn't as big numerically, the American Union movement, as the British one was in terms of number of workers covered, or percentage of workers covered, I should say, it was very powerful in certain key economic sectors. So Nixon, lifelong anti-communist and anti-worker candidate, shall we say, even he was obliged to take the American working class seriously in 1971. He realized that he couldn't afford to have a generalized worker revolt, so if he's going to put a ban on wage increases for 90 days, he better do a ban on price and rent increases as well. Now, Harris and Waltz and whoever writes their scripts keep sort of tiptoeing around the idea of some sort of price controls, but they're not going to do it for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. But also the Democrats keep talking about, or the left of the Democrats, should we say, keep saying that there's a chance of like rent controls, either at a local or a federal level, if we all just pull together and vote for Harris and Waltz this time. I think pretty sure this is the argument made by a certain Mr. Ben Burgess and his friends. Of course, that's not going to happen either. They're not even going to go as far as Nixon did in 1971. What will end up happening is exactly what the Washington Post says is going to happen today, according to Democratic Party insiders. this anti-price gouging plan will turn into nothing of the kind, and there will be no imposition of rent controls at a federal level, and any attempt at this on the local level or state level will be patchy, incoherent, and end up not having any impact at all, because that is just how the system is these days. Now, there is, of course, the other question here, which is, why does Trump immediately reach for the communism epithet? Well, partially because it's Trump. He's not running with a lot of original material these days. Back in 2016, excellent comedy material from Trump. Now he just sounds like a sort of slightly more amusing Ted Cruz. So they immediately reach for the communism thing. But the furious response, even from people inside the Democratic Party, shows us that how things have changed since the Nixon era, over 50 years ago now. As I said, Nixon had to reckon with a much more powerful workers' movement and had to take that into account. But now, when it comes to the state of the American economy, the state of monopolization now has advanced far further than it was in 1971. So you look at like the who are the big food producers in the United States. You'll all have seen the meme going around with a sort of graphic showing all of the biggest food producers inside the United States, and like what that actually looks like. So like you examine it, and I'll just put the graphic on the screen. Actually, it's easier than me describing it. You examine this, and you can see that you can see the advanced status of monopolization. So the major food companies go back to ultimately Nestle, PepsiCo, Kellogg, Associated British Foods, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Kraft, Mars, etc. And a lot of those are transatlantic. A lot of those, of course, have gigantic interests in this country as well. But the point being that, like, most of the brands you see on the shelves, of course, aren't individual companies. They're all just imprints owned by somebody else. So with less than a dozen major companies in the United States actually operating the food monopoly market there, they are the ability of the government to actually impose price controls on these has lessened since the Nixon period, in some respects, because these companies are a lot bigger and are a lot more powerful now. So what you actually have is a situation where telling these companies what to do is something which is less possible now for a federal government headed by a standard politician. But it does open up the question, which is, given that you've now got like less than a dozen companies controlling like most of the American food supply, like you've got these giant agribusinesses, and then of course you have to ask the question, well, who owns Kellogg's, who owns Nestle, who owns Kraft, who owns Coca-Cola, and trace their ownership structures back. Usually you have BlackRock or the Vanguard Group or any of the other monopolists behind the monopolists, so to speak, in their major listed in their major or even their minor shareholdings. But so where you have these giant companies that control so much of food production and distribution, then the question is, well, can you tackle that with price controls? And the answer has to be, of course, no, because no politician is willing to defy these gigantic monopoly companies, as Harris's very rapid climb down shows, and Trump's passionate defense of monopoly capitalism. Got to give the man credit for his consistency. So how could you actually affect this then? How could you actually affect this in a way which would lower prices for the American worker? Now that is the interesting question. The whole point about price controls is that they are usually implemented, of course, at times of crisis. I mean, you had both price controls and rationing here in Britain in World War II. That lasted, the rationing did, until about 1955. So it's possible to do even under capitalism. So price controls in themselves don't mean communism and don't mean socialism either. It's a lie, and a rather clumsy one, to say that it is. And it wouldn't surprise me then if somebody like Richard Wolff started to say we should all vote for Kamala Harris because she might put in price controls a la Nixon. So if there was a communist candidate running for the presidency of the United States, an actual one, then what could you propose to the American working class to make it clear that you could control prices? Well, you take a look at who are the big monopolists inside the United States, the big food monopolists, and you simply declare that all these companies are to be nationalized. That's the first step. They obtain complete control over the food monopolists. That's the way, the only way you're actually going to be able to reduce prices, because it's not just about control over production, control over distribution. Then, of course, you have to make sure that you then rationalize that system, and of course, ultimately, you would need to incorporate this as part of the overall planned economy. But as an immediate step to reduce prices, you can declare that all these companies are abusing their monopoly position, which even liberals will admit that they are. Even liberals will admit that monopolists are free to dictate prices, or much freer to dictate prices, that this isn't by any stretch of the imagination a free market, because as we all know, if you've read Lenin in any way adequately, you'll understand that the days of free competition disappeared over 150 years ago. Monopoly now is all capitalism has on offer, because this is the imperialist phase of capitalism. And herein we have to elaborate somewhat, because the monopolist phase of capitalism is imperialism. And imperialism isn't just, British men in pith helmets beating natives and enslaving people. That might be part of it, but it's also how capitalism evolves inside the imperial core countries. So when you're looking at the food monopolies, you can see clearly that how the advancement of monopolization it defines this period of capitalism. So if you look at the food monopolies, you can see that of course, they are all ultimately will be backed by some bank or another. They'll all be the merger of agricultural, industrial, and money capital. The merger of industrial and money capital being a core part or a component part of the making of imperialism, and therefore you can take from that the imperialist phase again is not just about what happens overseas. It's the concentration of production or extraction, production, exchange and distribution under a system which is fundamentally controlled by giant monopolies, which often are backed by banks or are merged with banks. And the export of capital overseas to find resources and labor to hyper-exploit is a crucial part of that. But the concentration of production into monopolies is the other is the other element of it. So let me just give you an indication as to what this looks like. I'm going to do a quick screen share with you. Now, where are we? There we go. So this is just a quick indication. I think this is taken from an Oxfam chart of a few years ago. But that there you can see like how few companies there actually are operating in both the this is mainly the American market. This also applies, I think, to Britain as well. But there is a British monopoly in there. But take a look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 monopolists control the overwhelming majority of like the supply of food products that appear on the shelves in the United States. There are of course exceptions to this. There will be regional variations, but if you actually were serious in this in the even remotest way about reducing prices, then you would have to abolish the monopolies, because they aren't going to lower prices, not in a million fucking years. Why would they? Why would they damage their profit margins, and why would they take orders from politicians whose careers they have paid for? So the intermediate measure, or I should say the immediate measure, would be nationalization of all the food monopolies. Take everything they own under state control immediately, and do it. You can even do it using the existing emergency powers of the American presidency. Now, you couldn't do any of this stuff without, the ruling class immediately coming for anybody who tried to do it, and immediately trying to run a coup, running an assassination campaign, running a destabilization campaign. So we should say straight away that any sort of minimum program that a communist or communist-backed candidate would put forward for the American presidency would be predicated upon this explanation to the American masses that, look, if you tried to do this, they'd put up a lot of money to try and destabilize your government or kill you within minutes. So important to explain that the reason why you make such a demand isn't because you expect that you're going to get a president or a Congress in there who are going to be able to step forward and actually do it. What you're doing by raising the demand is that you are actually putting forward the demand to the population, to the workers, to the masses, and saying, well, look, this is the situation. This is what would have to be done in order to resolve the fact that the prices that you are paying for the essentials of life are going up and up and up. The profits of these less than a dozen monopolies are going through the roof. They will not reduce prices ever. They will only ever put them up. And the politicians won't do anything about it. The only way that you address this problem in the short term would be to end the control over the American food supply of the monopolists. And that would mean nationalizing them all, taking away all of their power and capital, and creating one unified system of food production for the country. And that would be a short-term demand. You would then have to explain why no president or Congress could do that, what the monopolists would do if their position was challenged. And I think a lot of American workers would understand that. They would understand that. I think many of them do right now. They just don't have the Marxist understanding, but they know that the monopolists exist. They know that the Congress works for the monopolies, and they know that no president is going to tackle that. Not Kamala Harris, not Donald Trump, not J.D. Vance, and not Tim fucking Waltz. No matter who gets in to the big chair in the end, they're all just a servant of a very small, tiny number of people in the United States, or Britain, or France, or Germany. The same situation exists in all of the imperialist countries. So, again, there are demands that could be made. There are actions that, in theory, the federal government, as currently constituted, and using its current powers, could take to alleviate the problems facing the American worker. But none of these actions will be taken. None of these solutions will be pursued, precisely because of the power of the monopolists and the fact that it is their system. You can't destroy their system by trying to use the tools it created to manage itself. It just doesn't work that way. But again, raise the demand in an election before the American working class to actually demonstrate what could be done and why it won't be done, and why the only way forward is in the struggle for socialism, not in the tinkering around the very outside edges proposed by people like Harris and Waltz, or the dyspeptic ramblings of Donald Trump, who has no problem with monopolies. Right, going to now take some questions from the floor and do some greetings. So, Krasovets, hello to you. Joseph, hello to you. Muzzle Paint, hello to you. Potted rodent. Yes, it is a reference to right-wing craziness. The title, that is. Edward asks, how can Eastern European proletarians organise when they have been turned into an austeriat and are en masse emigrating to the West, cutting the legs off underneath a communist movement? Well, this is why one of the things that has to be done is in the immediate period, the destruction of the EU can only be a positive thing for everybody concerned. And that's the reason why the EU was extended to Eastern Europe. It's to essentially create in Eastern Europe a giant reserve army of labour that can be used by the imperialists to bulk out their own working class population, to use them to create downward pressure on wages. That's what's being done. That's why the EU has been extended all the way into the East. Now, as to what could be done, I mean, there are still industries, there are still workers in Eastern Europe. They haven't all migrated west, but a good number have. So this is, as somebody, I think it was Isco Lat on Twitter who pointed this out to me, that what's actually being done in Eastern European countries since the counter-revolution of 1989 is like the German imperialism has, well, and together with the US imperialism, has been enacting the old a version of the old Nazi General Plan Ost, plan for the East, which is reduce birth rates to levels below that of the Third Reich, as it was, Germany today. Ensure that the native population cannot be more educated than those in the imperial core, and instill a servile attitude towards the so-called master race. This is, of course, the project that was not created by the Nazis. It was one that was inherited from German imperialism under the old Kaiser Reich, under the old German Empire. And this isn't just a plan for Eastern Europe. This is a plan for all colonized peoples. If you look at like the internal calculations of the imperialists, they're always caught between two schools of thought. One, they want to keep the populations who they regard as inferior are firmly under control, their birth rate under control. But they also need this huge reserve army of labour that they can bring into the imperial core countries. And that puts them in a slight bind, of course. But they are absolutely definite about the fact that they must instill a completely servile attitude towards the gardeners, to use Joseph Borrell's phrase, and ensure that the population remains poorly educated or becomes poorly educated. That's what has been the aim of the German imperialists, the French imperialists, and the behind them the US imperialists over the last 30 years, to decimate these countries. Now, eventually, what's going to happen is that there's going to have to be revolts in these places. They can't just export the entire proletariat to the West. First of all, there's going to be a problem in the West soon due to the fact that there is a rising political instability, and the ability of these countries to soak up excess labor or the reserve army of labor from the East is going to come under extreme pressure. So there's going to be fewer and fewer jobs available in the West soon, which means that the fight has to be to rebuild socialism in these countries. But these countries which are being reduced to a sort of slightly newer version of what they were prior to socialism. Now, nothing can ever go back. A river cannot flow upstream. But prior to socialism, countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, well, Poland was divided between three different empires, Baltic states, these were all countries that were dominated by one imperialist power or another, that were sparsely populated and poorly educated. That's essentially what they've gone back to, because that's the plan that the imperialist powers have always had for them. So there'll have to be there will be a revolt of the population in these countries at some point. The problem is that the effect of the counter-revolution of 89 to 91 was far more devastating than I ever thought. The civility that was instilled in 2 generations of Eastern Europeans towards the West. Again, I'm not blaming the working class for this. I'm just saying that this is what's happened. The instilling of civility and the destruction of education, the promotion of ignorance, the promotion of vice in all these countries, essentially created a system where these nations are being destroyed. So there will have to be a fight back at some stage, and it will happen. There will always be a revolt of the proletariat in the end. It just means that the communists in the east of Europe will have to work to overcome all these legacies, and they will be overcome because the capitalists can't escape the contradictions that they've created forever. The domestic capitalists can't escape it, neither can the imperialists. So a revolt will happen. I think it's probably something I will need to go into in much greater length as to what's happened and why. But I would say that when the collapse of the European Union comes, and it will come soon, that that will be the point where there will be much wider struggles breaking out across the East. I think the defeat in Ukraine will also kick a lot of people up the arse in the East, because seeing the West visibly fail will have a powerful effect on those in Eastern Europe. Right. Where are we? Where are we? Hang on. Zauter, good evening to you. Good evening to Luca. Jonathan Foster says, Kamala, maybe, according to Trump. Ben, good evening to you in southwest Hungary on your Foundation Day. Is that Foundation of the Nation Day? Rick Deckard himself says, every 4 years we alternate between saving democracy from fascists or communists. Well, it depends what your choice of delusion is, doesn't it? Greetings to Arnold and Grassy Knoll and Abtin and Yep X. Does Trump even know who Brezhnev was? Brezhnev? Yeah, I know who he is. He's a great guy. He came to my casino once in Atlantic City. Lost a fortune in rubles. Terrible guy. Didn't pay his debts. Greetings to Svetlana in Moscow. BWP has arrived from Kamala's Communist Caucus. Joke. Good evening to Peter in Perfidious Albion. Good evening to Alex Oliveira and David Greenwood. Richard Nixon's famous quote was, "We are all Keynesian now." Yes. Didn't last too much longer after that, Keynesianism. In fact, it was pretty much... I mean, it might be one of the... Nixon was more of an industrial interventionist in some respects, but certainly his successors in the Republican Party firmly embraced full-speed deindustrialization. Nick Millin says, ILWU, our last good union over here, but we're a shell of what we were in the 30s and 40s. Is that the... Correct me if I'm wrong, Nick. Is that the Longshoremen's Union? Alex Oliveira says, I still remember people calling Obamacare socialism. Yeah, Glenn Beck, people, etc. I mean, the reason why they do it is to basically associate socialism with anything that's going to be unpopular. So, I mean, maybe Glenn Beck actually did believe in what he was saying. I don't know. But for the people who are a little bit more switched on, if you can associate socialism with a failing bureaucratic, gigantic subsidy system for the health insurance industry, which is what the Affordable Care Act was and is, then you can denigrate the name of socialism with it. And that's why they do it. Royalist in Exile says, hope you're all doing well in the land of the police state, also known as the United Kingdom. Same as it ever was, mate. Same as it ever was. Good evening to Jerry, who joins us. Irish Partisan, greetings to you out there in Minsk. Sid Hatfield, good afternoon to you. Lome Bart says, neither Kamala nor Donald have the slightest idea who Marx was. Harris might. I mean, her old man is a... supposedly a Marxist professor. In their absolute ignorance, they use communism as an absurd weapon. Well, Trump certainly does. President Jesus says, I wonder if Kamala will come out for worker co-ops and federal financing for geodesic domes. If Richard Wolff asks her, maybe she will. Then we'll get Richard's epic endorsement of Kamala whilst he's speaking to Ben Norton or something. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Oligopolies, says Rick Deckard. The CEOs of Unilever and Nestle probably play golf together and set the prices. Maybe so, maybe so. Hello to Yuan out there in Phoenix, Arizona. Matt Vollmer joins us and is enjoying the channel. VLX 11387, got a play on THX 1138. And American food isn't even that good. It's poison most of the time. Gerardo apparently is down for the nationalization of the monopolies. Well, to address the 2 points together, look, the way you improve quality in American food, not just American food, but all food, is like you have to, once you've taken control of the means of production, distribution and exchange, is then if you're building socialism, if you have an American workers' state, let's just say this, then what you would need to do is, of course, then you would need to change the way that farming is done. I mean, there's a lot of the capitalists have rather conveniently collectivized the land in the United States for us. So it would just simply be a matter of taking it over. Collective farming in the United States already exists. It's just done by capitalists. So you would need to reorganize. And like there's a lot of the lessons that you can take from the old collective farm experience in the Soviet Union, like regarding actually how to produce quality food, how to cut down on the amount of chemicals used, how to actually put food on the shelf that doesn't have 1,000 different pesticides and other such shite in it. All of this is possible to do. There are more natural growing techniques available out there to be learnt from, and of course you can have meat that isn't shot full of antibiotics and all manner of growth hormone. The removal of the profit system will allow a degree of rational development of food and food production methods that just isn't there at the moment. At the moment, everything is designed for the maximization of profit, not the actual benefit of the people eating the food. DE says, at least it looks like Gates' fake meat shite has not found enthusiasm amongst the general population. Yeah, that was never going to work. Trust me, they've been obsessed with this idea. The capitalist class has been obsessed with the idea of feeding the working class on basically like gruel for over 250 years, since the beginning of industrial capitalism in Britain. As soon as a proletariat was formed, the ruling class, and Marx quotes this in Capital Volume 1, the ruling class in the 1780s, I believe, were already desperately trying to find ways of feeding this the proletariat on as gruel-like collection of shite as possible. So they were trying to work out in the late 18th century in Britain the exact amount of energy that a standard worker would need to perform his duties for the week and not collapse and die on the job, maybe. They were trying to calculate that in order that they could deliver some kind of fish-based soups or anything that could be produced in a dirt cheap fashion that would provide the minimum level of calories to allow the worker to do his work for the day. And they've been obsessed with finding this minimum level ever since, in order that it can be delivered in as cheap a fashion as possible. And there's been various attempts at this. And so it's no surprise that with the system in crisis, with a profitability and overproduction crisis hitting the system, that they're now interested in trying to find this holy solution for themselves again. Fake meat being one of these things, eat the bugs being another one, very easy and cheap to produce. They keep trying every time there's a crisis to find some way to reduce the consumption level of the proletariat down to as little as possible. Again, this is a trick that they have been up to for 250 years, and it never quite works for them. They thought they'd really got onto something with fake meat. They really thought they'd really got onto something with the bugs, but nobody wants either. Though the way things are going in Britain, I'll probably wake up tomorrow morning and find that Keir Starmer's sat down doing a live stream with Bill Gates, eating a plate of bacon and following it up with a nice deep-fried plate of beetles or something. Who knows what this man will do? But yes, very old obsession of the ruling class. In fact, an obsession as old as capitalism and the proletariat itself. Sid Hatfield says, our minds would be blown if we were to actually see how tiny the core elements of the ruling class are in number. It's probably fewer than 5,000 to 7,000 men and women. With the addition of their extended families, they probably number no more than 200,000. In terms of the actual ruling class of the United States, and we have got a program coming up on this, yeah, I would say at the very most, though, in terms of those who actually own the important stock, own the important land, yeah, upper end estimate 500,000, and that's the upper end estimate. Then you have a much larger, but still not altogether very big layer of like very well paid functionaries who probably number in the low millions. Then you have a wider layer of people in like the classic petty bourgeoisie, and the again, like those who are decently paid functionaries of imperialism. So the numbers of those who are actually in the ruling class, who are directly tied to them, who are well paid enough servants of the system to remain fanatically loyal to it. I'm going to just throw a complete guess at you in terms of the United States, and if I'm wrong, you are, of course, feel free to tell me. I would say the numbers of these people don't number more than 5 to 7 million at most. That would be my guess. I mean, what's the US population now? 330 million? So no more than 5 to 7 million absolute tops would be the ruling class themselves, the layer, like all the different layers of the capitalist class, the layer immediately below them, the most well-off bits of the petty bourgeois and the well-paid officialdom. 5 million absolute outside figure. That's me being, in fact, generous. So it's not a numbers thing. You know, the ruling class in the United States don't rule because, like, they are, of course, preponderant in terms of numbers. What you have is a system built by a very, very tiny number of people with a bigger layer of paid servants around them and retainers, who would easily be destroyed within 24 hours by the US proletariat if the US proletariat was adequately educated and organized and motivated to do so. The trick of the ruling class is to make sure that the US proletariat, this potentially world-changing force, if it were to stir into action, remains divided, remains confused, remains poorly educated, remains demoralized, remains unhealthy and distracted. And this is the game. Hello to Slava. Gerardo says, Bukele in El Salvador did something similar recently with food prices, right? He got shit from the US for it. Yes, I believe he did slap a price freeze on. He actually did it. As same thing. Bukele is a bit of an interesting character, something of a reactionary in many ways, but erratic and eccentric. So prone to going off in his own way, which is why the US has a rather tempestuous relationship with him. RVA Klavic joins us from Detroit. Jerry says, Putin's invited people to Russia without the language culture filters on for 3-month visas. Svetlana says, you don't need to know Russian to get a 3-month visa. I know enough Russian to read a newspaper headline at the moment. Hopefully learning more. Good morning to Bob in Australia. Yepek says, have I heard about the arrest of Richard Medhurst? Yeah, he was arrested and held for a while with under the Terrorism Act, and then I think he was released, just as Kit Clarenberg was, just as my own comrades were back in November of last year. Now, what this is, of course, is targeted harassment campaigns against journalists and political dissidents, shall we say. They couldn't have charged Medhurst with anything. Well, they could have done. Under the laws in this country are so harsh that you could charge people with terrorism if they just supported a particularly militant strike. That's why the laws are written that way. But if you tried to take Medhurst to court, or indeed Kit Clarenberg, who's joining us this week, by the way, for another interview, you'd have to make a case in court to actually prove that these people were terrorists. And that at that point, the state would open itself up to all kinds of challenges as to the way its laws are written, as to whether it can prove any of this, and it would shed the remaining elements of the liberal democratic veneer that the ruling class still find useful to keep up. So what they do with acts like the Terrorism Act is that they use it to detain people. They use it to arrest people. They use it to essentially intimidate and frighten people. And it's not just the Terrorism Act they do this with. They've done this with all kinds of legislation as well. Back in the days of the miners' strike of 84 to 85, they arrested loads of mine workers who were on strike. And the charges against them were either dropped or collapsed in court because they couldn't prove any of it, because they were just mass arresting people with no evidence. The aim isn't to bring a case. The aim is to intimidate. And I'm sure that it didn't work. It didn't work on Clarenberg. It probably won't work on Medhurst either. But that's the reason why they use it. It's not to make cases. It's to intimidate people. Good evening to Robert Svorinich, and Todd. Slava says, chaotic protests are happening right now in Chicago at the DNC. What do I think about that? Well, I don't think it's going to lead. Well, I don't want to be too cynical here, but what's the best that can happen? The best that can happen from these protests is that those who attend them are radicalized by the experience to the point where they are prepared to turn their backs forever on not just the Democratic Party, but the bourgeois political system as it currently stands, including so Democrats and Republicans. If attending these protests and presumably being subjected to Chicago police violence gets people to examine not just Biden or Harris or Trump, but Biden and Harris in this case, or Harris in particular, and the Democratic Party, and gets them to realize that there is not only no difference between them and Trump, them and the Republicans, but this is a double act which is there to con the American worker. If some of these people going to these protests, or those who see these protests, realize that, then they've done something of a good job. That's the only good outcome, though. The protests themselves and raising demands of the DNC is a useless endeavor. You might as well go and raise them on Trump as well. Trump might even give you an audience, though. I would be very suspicious of those who are pretending that there's going to be some concession over the Israel question by Kamala, because there are those on the American left who are pretending very hard right now. Let's just drop the soft language. Who are lying right now to Americans that Kamala Harris is more open to a ceasefire than Biden is. She's open to an arms embargo. None of this is true, but you've had various people on the American left hint that it might be, because these people are just so desperate to vote Democrat and want to find an excuse for doing so. Some of them are paid hacks. Some of them are in professions which are linked to the Democratic Party. Most of them, Joe, are just sad idiots who don't understand anything and don't want to be seen as enabling the bad guy Trump. The only progress that can ever be made is when the American left is completely severed from the Democratic Party, because the American left for 50 years now, more, maybe longer, has been run by a professional activist layer from academia and from the wider petty bourgeoisie, who are often linked directly to various ruling class institutions. And their party of choice, when it comes down to it, is the Democrats, because they don't care for the Republicans. They find the Republicans too crude, too racist, too bigoted, etc. They prefer the Democrats, who will, kill as many foreigners, but will do it with a smile and a rainbow flag. That layer, who are embedded within the Democratic Party, who dominate the American left, that layer needs to be pushed aside. And the organizations which continually try to handcuff all grassroots movements in the United States to the Democratic Party, all of those people need to be pushed aside as well. And if the process we're going through now helps do that, then again, these are positive things. Sid Hatfield says, Glenn Beck makes allegations today that are on a par with what the John Birch Society was saying 70 years ago. He would have people believe Google, Facebook, BlackRock, etc. are communist organizations. Well, you used to get that, as Sid says in his comment. John Birch people were saying that about like Rockefeller and the big capitalists like 70, 80 years ago. You get this sort of strain of American petty bourgeois radicalism, that sort of libertarian types, who basically claim that all the big capitalists must be communists, because communism means government, and all of these big capitalists are linked in with the government, therefore they all must be communists. So it's like a strange hall of mirrors analysis. Because these people on the American right are rooted, their base is the American small business petty bourgeois, who, again, let's just go back to how Marx and Engels defined them, permanently sandwiched between the big bourgeoisie, the monopoly capitalists who we've just been discussing, and the proletariat, who they hate. They hate both, but they fear the proletariat and envy and fear the monopolists. And they're stuck between them. And because America has this still active bourgeois revolutionary tradition that, well, not active in real terms, but its image is still there. The words of the founders are still there. And you have people like Jefferson being on record as saying things like the government is best that governs least, and things like that. And so it gives a sort of an ideological foundation for John Birch types, as you also have this sort of American tradition of the idea of the homestead, the idea of the frontier, the idea of getting away from established class structures back in the old countries of Europe. And so for a lot of American petty bourgeois rightists, radicals, libertarians, they see that America's become just as much of a rigid, stratified class society dominated by a tiny group of monopolists as any European country, and their brains can't handle it. So their theory says, well, this must be communism. It must be a communist plot. Mark Zuckerberg is actually a deep cover agent for China. Shit like that. All comes out of that sort of petty bourgeois reactionary tradition. Caustic Grip observes that Bodhi Judge's dad is an American Maltese Marxist, American Maltese Marxist. Yes, he's the guy who translated Gramsci into American English. Those translations are shit, by the way. I've read them. DE says some people think the World Economic Forum is communist as well. Yeah, same thing. It's very strange with the lockdown experience and the protests against it led me to meet a few of these people, who have correctly identified that the British economy is dominated by monopolies, who have correctly identified that Parliament is a joke, that it does what the monopolies tell them to do. But then they just go, because they've got a strange delusion in their minds about what the economy and society could be in Britain. It's the same small shopkeeper mentality, the idea the small businessman mentality. They can't handle the idea that the natural tendency of capital is towards monopoly. You know, their idea is that their idea is that capitalism is this wonderful thing that leads to like small and medium enterprises that looks like, well, their businesses basically, and the monopolies are the distortion. In actual fact, the monopolies are the natural endpoint, and they don't want to admit that, so they have to engage in all manner of like weird mental gymnastics. So you're saying that Klaus Schwab is a secret Marxist or something? Kamala is rarely sober. How has the media covered this? They don't, Abtin, to answer your question. They they will never talk about that. Same way they never used to talk about JFK sticking his dick in anything that stood still long enough. Or they didn't. Oh, they never mentioned any of the serious shit that Clinton had done. I mean, like Clinton is essentially JFK with, who's fatter, uglier, and with more media scrutiny. But like Clinton got away with rape. Clearly, I mean it's the Juanita Broderick allegations are regarded as credible by many people, and she's told the same story consistently for over 40 years to anyone who'll listen, but none of the media will. By the way, they put Bill Clinton up to speak again. The Democratic Party, the party that will tell you that Donald Trump is waging a war on women, put up a credibly accused rapist again at their convention to speak to the delegates. And it's not just that. I mean, there's all kinds of other allegations about Clinton as well. I mean, rape is one of them. There's all the other allegations about him and, shall we say, liaisons with various women that we don't know. So he's maybe one of the reasons why Bill is keen on defending abortion rights is because he's had to avail himself, well, not himself, but been a bit. He's been a cause of several, perhaps. But more than that, I mean, it's allegations that Clinton was a massive cokehead back in the 80s when he was governor of Arkansas. They used to get off his face with his brother, or is his brother or half brother, Roger Clinton. That he was, when he was governor of Arkansas, was implicated in like Iran-Contra business because like he knew that the CIA was using Arkansas airfields to land white powder in, and he knew about that. There's a whole stack of allegations against him, some of which are, come from like, John Birch type right wingers, which are a bit nuts. A lot of the rest of it, though, like the sex stuff, the drug stuff, the sex crime stuff, all sounds credible, and yet never a question, never an investigation, no serious one anyway. Why? Because Clinton's a loyal foot soldier of American imperialism. That's why. So yes, like the stories got so bad that a certain amount had to be admitted about Clinton because there was so much there. The old limited hangout technique. Like, so you have like a dodgy, like some bullshit investigation, so-called investigation by that clown Ken Starr, who found that, oh, Bill Clinton, his biggest sin was having it away with a woman who, whilst she was younger than him, was of legal age, and that was his big disgrace, which stinks of like what in certain circles is called the limited hangout operation. You admit to the least offensive thing, the least illegal thing that Bill Clinton has done, make the story all about that, and then make it just Clinton. Bill's just a cheeky boy. I just enjoy a certain kind of woman, and you make him just like a sort of Randy Arkansas, horn dog, rather than what he is, which is a criminal. For many reasons. On a personal level, the man is clearly a criminal, and allegedly a criminal in many other ways which violate the law as it stands inside both Arkansas and the wider United States. Like, why has he never been questioned about the Epstein flights, which he was on, and everybody knows he was on? Never questioned about it. Why? Again, he's being protected because he's a loyal servant of the system. If he went off message and started saying things which those in charge didn't want to hear, then you'd see the investigation start. And then Bill would sadly expire from a weak heart in his penthouse apartment in New York. Well, how sad. But yeah, blatantly being protected. Same with George W. Bush, of course, all that shit about him, the shit he'd actually done as governor of Texas, and before as well. Even the same with Trump. I mean, like, for all the shouting and the screaming and the histrionics and the fakery around Trump, like the fake story about Russiagate. So they go after him with something that's completely fictional. Whereas there's loads of stuff about Trump that you could go after him for. You could go after him for his very prominent and confessed to mob ties. You could talk about the fact that his mentor was a man called Roy Cohn, a mob lawyer and former hatchet man for Senator Joseph McCarthy. But you could at least, even if you're an anti-communist Democrat, you could focus on Trump's mob ties, Trump's habit of not paying contractors, Trump's, well, they didn't even really, in a serious way, I mean, Mitt Romney did a little bit in 2016, go after Trump's pretty abysmal record in business, the fact that he's leveraged up to the eyeballs on everything he's involved with, like that nothing he's involved with makes much money. Well, some of it makes profit, but it all goes to pay down debt and other things. Much of what he does is complete. Much of his fortune is completely a complete fantasy. So why not go after Trump for any of that? I mean, there were stories on it, but there was never a sustained attack on him over these very, very weak areas. So why not? The answer is, of course, that if you did do that, then you go after Trump on mob ties, you go after Trump on dodgy bankruptcy shenanigans. There's more than enough people on the Democratic side who are guilty of all of those things and more. And Trump knows that, so he can respond in kind. So the big controversy they ginned up about Trump was something that was completely fake, something which was completely unreal. And they left to one side all of the stuff that Trump had actually done. Like, they didn't even really explore that much his relationship with Epstein, which, whilst not as extensive as Bill Clinton's, was still there. So again, like, look, if you want to know the truth about the fact that the Democratic Party apparently hates Trump so much, but they leave his association with the mafia to one side, they leave a serious examination about, well, who is Trump in debt to, actually? Why did Trump in the late 80s buy Adnan Khashoggi's yacht? That's an interesting question. Now, Adnan Khashoggi was, of course, the Saudi arms dealer who was caught up in the Iran-Contra scandal. I think Jamal Khashoggi was his nephew, the guy who was cut up and melted down by Mohammed bin Salman's hit squad, allegedly. So why is Trump buying Adnan Khashoggi's yacht? That's an interesting question. Who does Trump owe all this money to? Who keeps lending Trump money? If he's persona non grata in all of these areas of the United States now, all these businesses and banks turn their back on him, then why is his debt still getting serviced? How is he able to still borrow more money? I mean, he has been affected slightly by the court cases, but again, there's so many things. Trump's got a very public career of failures and disasters, and left a string of lawsuits behind him, and a lot of other very damaging things. But again, some attempts to go after him for that, but those were aborted pretty quickly, and they just focused on the stuff that was either fake or was never going to affect him too much. Again, it's because they can't go after Trump for all of the stuff I've just mentioned, because there's even worse examples of that on the Democrat side. So they got to go after him for fake shit. Sid Hatfield says, fascists do a critique of capital, albeit limited, but they are against the monopolized, financialized tendencies of it, which they attribute to the Jews. Yeah, that's true, especially in the case of Nazism. But again, it comes from the fact that fascism it grows out of the bourgeois, but its mass base is the petty bourgeois. So it has to reflect, its critique of capitalism reflects that petty bourgeois base, which makes it all about, Hitler called it plutocracy, or even they might even use the term monopoly. But again, they will never say, no fascist will ever say that the natural tendency of capitalism is always to go towards a monopoly situation. So they take it one stage further from saying, oh, the communists have have created these monopolies which are actually not capitalist at all. They take it one stage further and say, oh, the Jews got together with the communists. The Jews are both the communists and the bankers, and they created monopolies to cut the knees off the enterprising German small businessman. You know, it's a lot of this is to do with the fact that fascism, whilst it's a product of the bourgeois, has to become like a sort of hall of mirrors version of socialism in order to get itself a mass base within the petty bourgeoisie. Rick Deckard says microwave meals that cost £1 are the 21st century proletarian grub. And ain't that depressing? You're right, but isn't that depressing? And those monopolies control all of it. Abtin says the wretchedness of capitalism is sometimes hilarious in hindsight. The fully realised shite food within the prison system whilst maximising profit. Indeed they have. Just scrolling down. Ocean 2035 says, we are living in an era where imperialism has obtained most of its wealth and profits through the exploitation and looting of other nations' resources and labour. The system has increasingly relied on financial institutions, banking and stock markets while shifting much of its productive capacity abroad. As international hegemony wanes, the inevitable decline in wealth and power at home places even more pressure on the working class in imperialist countries. Therefore, it is crucial to support what Lenin said about imperialism being the last stage of capitalism and its reliance on the exploitation of the third world is 100% applicable to our era. Nothing fundamentally has changed. Yes, the situation has got worse. Rick says the ruling class are not the governing class. The ruling class select who gets to be in the big chairs. Sometimes these are people from the ruling class themselves. Often they're from the lower orders, the lower sections of the ruling class itself or the petty bourgeoisie, sometimes even the upper layers of the working class. This is what we mean. Well, this is where we bring in Gramsci's analysis of the role of the intellectuals. The intellectuals for the ruling class are often not from the ruling class, but they are brought in to basically be the thinkers and the governors for the ruling class. That's why the ruling class sets up so many schools to train people in. Alba Witch Wiggler says, Russia needs people. They know that within a generation they'll have assimilated the children of all comers regardless of their parents' ignorance. Interesting. You may well be right. Kyle and the Glitter Ball. Oh my God. Kyle Ball and his husband. Sorry. Yes, an unpleasant pairing to say the least. Alistair Page McGill says, saying real people on Facebook gush over Kamala is depressing and demoralising. Yes, it is. I would question how many of them are real people, though. RFK Jr. might be dropping out, says Muzzlepaint. Well, he sold his entire campaign to the Zionists, so I don't know why he's bothered to go this far. President Jesus says, breaking points, interviewed a leader from the uncommitted movement today who basically admitted they're all voting for Harris. Well, wasn't that great then? I mean, maybe the leaders are all being completely co-opted, but I hope that many of the people who went through this process have come out the other end with a more radicalized point of view. Maybe some of them will be radicalized to the point where they can check out the newly formed American Communist Party, because going back into the Democrats is just basically endorsing the woman who's been right there with Biden all the way along in the genocide, who never objected to it and has backed up Israel at every turn and will continue to do so. Zauter says, describing big business as communist is a great way to confuse the proletariat as it will deter them from researching communist thought. Indeed. Right, just scrolling down. T.G. Wilson says Clinton also bombed the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Sudan to distract from the Lewinsky scandal. Indeed, he did. Scumbag on every level. Found a book in a charity shop, asks Hen Knapp, on the Venezuelan Revolution by Alan Woods. I'm still reading the book, though, even though he's a Trotskyist. Am I likely to miss anything crucial in the analysis? Don't know, because I haven't read it, to be honest. I mean, even though Alan Woods is a Trotskyite, I'm not going to comment on a book that I haven't read. So what I would say to you, Hen Knapp, is if you have questions about that book, then feel free to pose them in the chat. But I'm not going to comment on Woods' book because I haven't read it. Apparently Woods has also written a book called Marxism in the USA. My God, that man has a good budget, doesn't he? Luca says, I find liberal senior manager types the less class conscious by far. They live in the dream world of the Guardian or the Economist, pull over their eyes without questions. Yes, they have just enough wealth to have illusions, Luca. I've met those people. They're the most deluded people in the entire system. Good morning to Ash, who is already in Wednesday. Good to have you with us. T.G. Wilson says, Whitney Webb covers Roy Cohn's network in One Nation under blackmail. Yes, that's something I will have to look at. Ian Foster says, thinking about Nixon, the last New Deal president, and as poor as he was, am I being wrong-headed in thinking him better than any that have followed him? Clinton being the very worst. I would say the way to look at it is this. Like, Nixon was a bitter reactionary, just as bad as Johnson before him. The way to look at it is that Nixon looks better now, 50 years on, because of the reasons I was talking about earlier, which is Nixon had to reckon with the Soviet Union. Nixon had to reckon with a much more powerful American proletariat, an American labor movement. And so and of course there was the American economy, even though it was sliding towards it, was subject to a much lesser degree, or slightly lesser degree, of monopolization. All of those combined together to create a different atmosphere. And in that different atmosphere, different things emerge. So Nixon, as a more state interventionist, avowedly Keynesian figure, was possible because of those combination of circumstances I've just talked about. Now, you remove all of those circumstances, yes, every single figure who came after him embraced wholesale deindustrialization and decay, deindustrialization and monopolization. So yes, next to everybody who came after him, Nixon looks amazing. But then again, you stick George W. Bush next to Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Eisenhower looks like a communist. So again, it's the context and the strength of the domestic class struggle, the strength of the domestic working class, and the strength of the global anti-imperialist movement that created these various politicians in Europe and the United States who were much further over to the towards social democracy, even in the American sense, than they are now, and therefore look infinitely better than those that came after them. But again, like we should all, just like when we're dealing with the British Social Democrats, we must always say that they were created by a unique combination of circumstances, the center of which was the after effects of the October Revolution and the successful prosecution of the 5-year plans by the Soviet Union and the victory in the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union. That created this series of concessions in the system, which continues to confuse things to this day, but it can never come back, of course. President Jesus says the dirty little secret is the deep state protects Trump, which is true. And we're going to be doing a show on that later this week. Morgan says, on RFK, he blitzed his campaign by wrapping himself in an Israeli flag, but now he's held out long enough to be kingmaker. Gives more leverage for a role in Trump's admin. Yeah, if he drops out and endorses Trump, that'd be interesting. Regarding Trotskyism in general and the Venezuelan Revolution, Hen Nap. Well, the Alan Woods is a curious one because they were all over the Venezuelan Revolution until quite recently, until about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. So Alan Woods used to appear on Venezuelan television, I think, for a while. So depending upon when that book's from, it may be a very favourable one towards the Venezuelan Revolution, or it may be a hostile one because they turned hostile towards it after a while. So it depends when that book's from. So Woods' view, I don't know, because it again depends when he wrote that book. Because they were in favour of, or they said they were in favour of the the Bolivarian Revolution for a while. Again, I haven't read their analysis for a few years, so I don't know where they stand now. The general Trotskyite line towards Venezuela, though, has been hostile and has been sort of ultra-left rejectionist and objectively pro-imperialist. Well, Ian, I'm glad you got something out of the comment that I made there. Yeah, like we're all you were taught when we are at school and afterwards and in society in general to view things in isolation. Like the one of the absolutely central parts of Marxism is to always locate things within their proper set of relations. So you can only understand Nixon by looking at him in the full set of relations in which his presidency and his vice presidency existed. You can't just take this and sever it and declare, well, Nixon's better than Clinton or Clinton's better than Bush or something like that. Well, without understanding the full set of relations which these political figures operate within, domestically and internationally, then you're not going to get a clear and accurate picture. And we're all encouraged towards this sort of shallow pop culture analysis of these things. So that's something for us all to get over. Right, okay, so been going for an hour and 19 now, so I'm going to need to draw things to a close for this evening. Join me again tomorrow, where we're going to be talking about the latest from, probably the latest from both Ukraine and Gaza. So 7:30 tomorrow, roughly, for that one. Thursday, the Stalin series returns. Keep rescheduling that one, but we will be back on Thursday of this week. So keep an eye out for the confirmation of when those shows are. So be sure to check out our Patreon page where the audio versions of this will be uploaded very, very soon. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And thanks to everybody who has contributed to the chat tonight. As I say, I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Until then, have a good evening or morning, wherever you are in the world.